Kate, thank you very much for agreeing to join us today in our CEIS20 podcast. Kate is an associate professor at the Australian National University, and she was recently at the University of Coimbra presenting her work at our center. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to interview today and talk a bit about the work you do. So maybe we'll start with...
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start with you telling us a bit about who you are, a bit of your background, what your research focus in, and a bit of your, sort of research history.
So I'm an archaeologist who works primarily on later European prehistory. That's from about 6,000 years ago to about 2,000 years ago. And that's actually a pretty broad spread for a later prehistorian. A lot of people work on kind of 500 or 1,000-year chunks. I tend to work on bigger pieces because my interests aren't necessarily in a specific place or group of people, but in bigger phenomena like technology and technological change, or the kind of current project, kinship and kin structures, and how we understand how people kind of formed and understood kin and relation in the past. So I use a variety of archaeological materials from artifacts like pots and stone tools, site maps to look at changes in the landscape, and then compare that with stratigraphic information about excavations that tell us about the histories of formations of specific sites, and also with work done by colleagues in the sciences, so biomolecular work that looks at things like isotopes that tell us about diet or mobility, and also DNA. And it's the DNA that I've been focused on a lot recently because integrating DNA information into archaeology is proving a little bit rocky. I think we're getting there, but it's been a little bit rocky. And so I've been trying to work from the archaeology side to integrate it more holistically and less kind of combatively into the field.
Great. So I'm really interested in this last bit, of course, for sort of my own selfish reasons as a geneticist, but maybe perhaps you could tell us a bit about some of so not only how your research is interdisciplinary, so how you're sort of contributing to that conversation, but also what are the main challenges, because you did mention some challenges and sort of what are the main obstacles, I'm guessing perhaps in terms of communication across fields and so on. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
So I guess the first thing to say before the kind of challenge, the interdisciplinarity of it all, archaeology is one of those great fields that can't really exist without sibling disciplines. We could dig holes in the ground, but we can't understand the stratigraphy without our friends in geology, and we can't understand the kind of histories of technology without our friends in history of technology and science technology studies. We lean very heavily on our close sibling discipline, social anthropology, for our social interpretations of the past and the way that we model past society. We work very closely with physicists and chemists and biologists in all sorts of ways. So, extending that to working with geneticists and genomics labs is not that unusual for us. I think it's more unusual for the genomics labs to be doing this than it is for the archaeologists. We're kind of used to figuring out how to get on the same page. And a lot of it is just getting on the same page. It's figuring out, what language we use. And one of the big sticking points is the language of human society and the language of genomics often use the same words for different reasons. So what we mean by a population isn't necessarily what a geneticist means by a population. Similarly, when we talk about, if you said population replacement to someone who works in human society, you get big pictures of genocide or major migration or huge kind of full society scale level, often catastrophic processes. Whereas if you say population replacement to a geneticist, you're talking about a process of gene flow that doesn't necessarily happen kind of in a moment or a lifetime, may take several generations to happen, and is kind of very bloodless and disconnected from those social practices, right? So like a big part of the basics is just making sure that we understand the vocabulary we're using and what we each mean by it. It's not always obvious that we mean different things by it until suddenly we're having fights on social media about someone's huge paper and the headline that the newspapers have run away with. I think, more fundamentally, there are issues around how we understand data and how we build interpretation. So from a kind of social sciences side, and particularly from an archaeology side, we understand data as being constructed by the process of doing research. We kind of segment chunks of the world around us, and those become the data for analysis. And then in doing the analyses on those segments, we create more data for interpretation. And so there is a kind of human element there that we're always very aware of. And particularly on the archaeology side, we're very aware of the limitations of all of these data because our materials are so fragmented. The sites we work on are incomplete. We don't excavate 100% of anything. Even if we did, the nature of preservation over the kind of long timescales we work at mean that 100% of the material that was there at the moment it was deposited isn't there at the moment it's excavated. The techniques we use for recovery of materials change kind of quite stringently over generations. So material that was excavated 50 years ago is differently complete than material excavated 50 months ago. And that's just kind of those are the constraints in which we operate. And those constraints aren't necessarily obvious if you haven't been kind of trained up in the discipline. You have data, you assume that data is a reasonable sample, that it forms perhaps a random sample, or that it, is readable for the, in case of genetics, the population level. But you may not know the kind of details of that data collection. So, it may be that you've got a wonderful selection of human remains from a site, but you may not realize that they were heavily fragmented before they ever made it to that site. That archaeologists might be very aware that there's a process of, say, human remains circulating in the population before being deposited together. But the geneticist just says, oh, I have 20 human remains from a site. That gives me a good view of the population from this area. But of course, the archaeologist would say, well, but those circulated for maybe 2 or 3 generations before they were deposited here. How do we have any sense that they were one population or from this area, or in any way reflecting of the kind of local residents of the place? And those are a little bit more difficult to bridge because those are kind of fundamental issues about what data are and how we work with them and how representative they are and how much we can interpret them and what they can tell us. And I think it's often very challenging, not just for our kind of colleagues in the hard sciences, but it's very challenging for a lot of archaeologists as well, the limitations of our data and the kind of big question marks that its incompleteness throws up. And then I think the other side of it is that, and this is kind of how I got involved in these debates, is that archaeology is very political. Archaeology and archaeological material has been involved in kind of public and nationalist arguments very much since the discipline's founding. And the idea of who owns the past or who controls the past or who tells the stories of the past is a big, very political, very fraught space. And again, this is something that in archaeology we're trained to be aware of. Not all of us perhaps embrace it as much, not all of us perhaps like it, but we understand that what we're doing has impact in the public sphere in very political and politicizable, let's say, ways. And I think it was pretty surprising, at least from kind of informal conversations, to a lot of my colleagues in genetics, that when they started messing with archaeological material, somehow their headlines weren't just getting picked up as interesting science stories, their headlines were getting picked up as important politics stories, and sometimes with very kind of perfidious spins on the data. People were picking up stories about genetic information from 5,000 years ago and using it to tell stories about nationalism or contemporary migrants or, white identity or non-white identity. And I think that was very confronting for a lot of people in a world where they're not necessarily trained to understand the work they're doing as innately entwined with kind of contemporary identity politics, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense, and I I think it was a follow-up question that I had, because you touched upon it in this answer a bit before, and I was gonna follow up on it. But I do have a slightly different question still related to this topic of the importance of what we do when we're trying to reconstruct the past. Is like, what is and given that we are in a center of, interdisciplinary studies where, people have various backgrounds, from the natural sciences to the social science, philosophy, and so on. What do you think? I mean, what are your? I mean, I do have my own views on the hopes that I have, that these sort of more holistic dialogues can help us sort of also translating our science to the public in a way that is not simplified, simplistic, and abusive of the sparse data we have, as you so accurately mentioned. So what do you have any thoughts about that? So how our work collectively can actually help sort of improving this conversation.
Yeah, I think, it's an ongoing issue, right? One of the things that's always a good idea is really speaking directly to the public. I perhaps to the frustration of, some of my colleagues, don't love talking to journalists. I'd much rather just, write a blog post or prepare something for public consumption or go on a podcast and kind of speak unmediated. And I actually think that that's useful because, if there's anything that the kind of the rise of the podcast has told us, is that people are really hungry for sophisticated information. They don't want their information mediated by kind of journalists who may not be subject area specialists. They want some, 18th century historian to give them 10 years of
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
intensive blog posts on the history of revolutions, which is the podcast that my partner is currently in the middle of. 10 years of the history of revolutions. And I think we can be more sophisticated, and because we are subject area specialists, we have the knowledge to be more sophisticated in how we present our own research and how we explain it, and more than just a kind of pull quote here or a pull quote there, an extended interview, a podcast, a blog post of our own that's 800 words of our own writing rather than a media office or a journalist. I think there's a lot of space to do that sort of direct and unmediated communication better, and to, speak in a slightly higher register. And some people are. I mean, we've got people writing books. I know there's been one quite well-known one that came out of David Reich's lab. I think Carlos de Luisa Fox has just put out one as well, but I haven't read it yet.
Me neither.
Yeah, it's on my list. I'll get there. And I think that's a good thing. I do think more of those, it might benefit those being co-authored again across the disciplines, because still inevitably when I'm writing my archaeological story, right? I'm writing my archaeological story and looking at the genetic information as data, but I'm not necessarily thinking about how that information was produced or the questions and the kind of research constraints that went into making it. I know that those exist, but that wasn't how I was trained, so I don't know that. And I can't help but thinking maybe one of the things we should be looking forward to is co-producing, again, in that kind of interdisciplinary space, some of these outward-facing, public-facing things. Podcasts like this, little interviews, but also maybe more extended conversations, more extended writing. Wouldn't it be great to write a book on, the archaeology and genetics of prehistoric Europe that's co-written by an archaeologist and a geneticist? Wouldn't that be a valuable thing to have?
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I think, because it's so hard at the moment that, for us to sort of master not only the nuance and techniques and discussion within our own fields. I mean, to have to cross across, to make that. So we need to work collaboratively. We need to think about the problems together. We need to try and answer them as incorrectly as it might be, but trying to at least understand the assumptions of each other.
Yeah.
I am also, I've been thinking about, I think we've talked about this before in a conversation informally, but I am a big proponent of having co-authored papers with dissident views as well. Because it's not, how often do we have like papers with 20 authors where, all the 20 authors agree on exactly everything? Let's be honest, that doesn't
Again,
really
very
happen.
informally, I asked someone once, and this is, over drinks at a conference, so take it with a grain of salt. But I asked someone once, why, even, 3 years later, new information had come out, and the paper that they'd presented information from was no longer kind of correct. There was new information, we had new things, and yet they still presented the argument the same way. And I asked how, because we wouldn't do that in archaeology. We would say, well, this was the idea then, and this is the idea now, and this is where I stand. And what that person told me, again, over drinks, was that for them, and I'm not going to universalize this, but this felt like it rung pretty true for these kind of massively authored papers. For them, those papers were like a contract between all the authors, that all the authors, it was the kind of minimum level that everyone could agree with. Not everyone was fully happy with everything, but everyone was kind of minimally on board enough. And the paper itself was kind of the contract amongst that author cohort. And so even though this presenter hadn't been, one of the minor authors, they were the first author on that paper, even though they were very aware that there was new data. And in fact, they were involved with producing that new data. When they were talking about the previous paper, they felt they couldn't breach that contract by reinterpreting that material in a public place without those other authors all being on board. And I thought that was a very different way of thinking about publications, for example, than perhaps we do on the social sciences side. And I don't know if that's universal or if that's the one person, but it did resonate with how I see my colleagues in the natural sciences present and talk about previous work.
Yeah, that's very scary. Because, sort of defeats the purpose of what we are doing, right? I mean,
it does, but also, right, if you think about, again, how knowledge is produced, if you're going to have a paper with 100 authors on it, that also kind of makes sense, that it puts different control structures around that information or that data, because you are not just, one person speaking for yourself and your co-author, who presumably, you intensely co-wrote the paper with. You're someone speaking for 100 different people who all had different contributions. It does, for me, raise a lot of questions about what authorship means.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And we were not 100 people on that paper. We were maybe like 15 or 20 people, and there were some disagreements on some of the interpretations we were having. And I even suggested, right, my co-authors to actually explicitly have it on the paper, right? That this is one possible interpretation, but author X, Y, and Z don't really think so, and they have these objections that because of this, and that's part of I would say a very healthy scientific discussion.
You know exactly where I stand on that, which is that I'm a big believer in multiple interpretations. If we claim to be scientists, right, and we claim to have hypotheses we test, then we should be open to having multiple things that could explain our hypotheses or that could challenge them. And we should be able to say here are kind of 4 different possibilities to respond to this research question, to respond to these data. They can be interpreted in multiple ways. And I think, we struggle with that across the disciplines. I don't think that's unique to the natural sciences or unique to anyone else. It's a very scary thing to think, I'm not going to present one idea, I'm going to present 4 ideas. Because in some level, it might be perceived as weakening your analysis. Oh, if any 4 of these are good, maybe anyone else could have written 4 more, and why should I read this one? But I think, I agree, it makes it more robust. I genuinely think if we're going to have the richness of co-authors, we should have the richness of perspectives as well.
Yeah, and I think it would also bring a degree of sort of honesty about the uncertainty of a lot of the things we're finding. So, and that's why we keep on having to, work on these problems, because they're never going to be settled, right? A lot of them, and that's what makes it so appealing, at least to me.
Yeah. Oh, the best part about archaeology is that you genuinely will never have a real answer. We don't have time travel, and I don't think we ever will, but even if we did, the physicists would say probably it would mess everything up anyways. So what you get from one trip wouldn't necessarily what you get from the second. So, I'll never be able to ask someone 3,000 years ago about who actually inherits the property in their family. If, as I think some of my research area is probably passing down property rights matrilineally. I have no way of knowing that. Literally, it's impossible to know. There's no writing, there are no people, there's no direct descendants. It's lost information.
Right.
And that's, for me, one of the most exciting parts about being an archaeologist is I can always be wrong. One new find, one new site, the whole thing flips upside down and changes pictures.
Right, but I guess it's finding, and I know you too, but you are too, but I find it, I am so comfortable with that. I have no sort of
I love it.
particular attachment to any of the ideas that I had so far. And yeah, I guess one of the interesting things as well is how, because you're talking about how unattainable some of the some of these past is, or all of the past. And I think that one of the difficulties I am finding as well sometimes is because on this communication with colleagues from other fields is first of all, and you've mentioned an example, for example, when you talk about population, right? And for a geneticist, the population is an abstraction, and perhaps for an archaeologist, it's something very concrete, right? It's made of actual people that lived in a particular place and time. And so the reconstruction of these abstractions, for example, for a geneticist, can have a very rigorous, accurate statistical analysis to go along. But when you're trying to directly translate that to people living as a community, in a particular time and place, it becomes extremely challenging, if not to say, impossible to sort of directly translate that. And so what I'm finding that I also think it's a bit detrimental to our own field in genetics is because it is so appealing to do so, to make that connection and translation. Sometimes there are abusive, interpretations of the data, and I think that at the end of the day, it might do wonders for the authors pushing these papers in like high-profile journals, but at the end of the day, it will be detrimental to the actual science and the credibility of genetic reconstruction of the past.
You can do a lot of violence with statistics, right?
Right.
We know that.
We've
been through this in archaeology. You can make a lot of stories that are statistical. And, this is the great crisis hitting so many of the social sciences, the quantitative social sciences. You can find a great number of things that are statistically significant that actually have no value, and you can create statistical significance very easily. Right. The reproducibility crisis of fields like psychology, for example, are really grappling with this question. Behavioral economics, same thing.
Ancient DNA has a reproducibility crisis too, right? I mean, it's not often, and I've been, anyway, it's not often that people go and say, let's redo this, right? Let's redo this analysis, and because it's a destructive type of research, and therefore it's very hard to ensure reproducibility. So.
But even then, you've got your kind of your broader p-hacking scandal, and even when you're not coming at things from a kind of bad actor perspective, right. I'm a behavioral economist, and I'm gonna, what was the story? Fake all my data to get a really good Nature paper, which most people don't do. Most people come at their research with great good faith, but it's still very easy to make things or to find things that are statistically significant, but don't actually have, in the more colloquial sense, significance. Right. And so it is that broader question, not just of, what are we mathing, but also what are we asking, and why are we asking it, and are we asking it the right way, and are the data the right data to answer this question, and how are our methods shaping? And these kind of broader methodological questions are ones that we often stop asking around the time we submit our PhDs, and I think in many cases they're the ones most worth coming back to. That's the kind of base science that I think all of us say, okay, well, I've done that. I've written the methodology. Now I can just do the right methods, and I know what I can do. But actually, I think it's worth coming back to those methodology questions pretty regularly and thinking about, what kind of questions am I asking? Why am I using these methods to answer them? How is that shaping my data? What are the materials I'm analyzing? Are they the right materials for these questions? All those, first year PhD student questions I think they should have a higher profile. And particularly, again, in this interdisciplinary space where we're trying to make knowledge together from very different kind of foundational knowledge assumptions. They should be the first order, not the kind of third order questions, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And, like that's something I've been also complaining about. And in fact, I think if after the PhD, you should even care, it should be an increasingly important consideration of your research, of our research, is to look at always questioning the assumptions. What are the questions, and being motivated by that? Because one of the risks is that, and speaking for genetics, you have access to this beautifully, developed technology where, it requires a lot of specialized knowledge, to go into a lab, to extract DNA, make sure there's no contamination, and then there's analysis, computational analysis on top of that, because we're talking about massive amounts of data. And the risk is, because it requires so many steps, to sort of do that from, top to end, that I think we risk preparing students and future researchers for being extremely good at implementing those methods, but not at understanding the motivation, the rationale, sort of the assumptions behind.
I have
and
so many of the same
behind this.
feelings. So many of the same feelings about archaeology. There are so many complex methods you have to master to do archaeology that sometimes we get caught up in those methods and stop asking what different methods do or don't do.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really, really down to like, how do you dig a hole in the ground? And there are a lot of different ways to dig a hole in the ground, and a lot of different ways that'll work just fine, and some ways that'll work better than others for different types of sites. But even building up that knowledge that like there are multiple ways to dig a hole in the ground, that takes a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of travel, a certain amount of ability to mess up, that is increasingly difficult, particularly in the world where PhD student funding never goes up but only goes down, and travel is often very fraught for many people, whether it's because they have caring responsibilities, or they don't have the money for it, or they have problems crossing certain international borders. There are lots of reasons why people find kind of moving and traveling increasingly difficult. And, all it does is make it harder to develop that kind of sophistication in methods, which is step one to sophistication in methodology.
Right. No, that's yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that's gives a more complete perspective, right? Because it also speaks to the mercantilization, I guess, how capitalism has sort of tainted this all of this endeavor. Anyway, Kate, what are your perspectives for your research in the future? How do you think, what are your plans, and how do you think it can sort of contribute to at least amend or try to make some of these issues better?
That's a big question.
That was not the point. So just tell us about your future perspectives in general. Like, don't have to go like all philosophical on
yeah. So right now I'm 1 year into a 4-year project. So my focus is really on that project, and is thinking about, again, these questions of kinship in the past, but also kinship between the disciplines more broadly, and thinking about our siblings over in genetics and how we can be better kind of academic kin with them. And there are various kind of elements of this that are underway or kind of ramping up. So hopefully that will kind of start chugging out publications soon. There are a couple in press, and there are kind of plans for various things along the way over the next few years. More broadly, I have a few we have a few big agendas that don't really sit with specific projects. One of them is bringing more human-focused and kind of power-focused narratives into how we talk about the past and how we talk about human society in the past. So thinking about gender and power, thinking about social structure and power, thinking about kin structure and power, and how those power relations articulate with the sorts of practices that turn into the material that we find in the archaeological record. And that conversation around power often boils down in archaeology to a pretty narrow discussion of inequality. How does inequality emerge? What are the traces of inequality? What does inequality look like? And I think, you know, as we know, power is a much more complicated thing. It flows very complexly between different social groups. It's very contingent. And so finding better and more sophisticated ways to talk about that is certainly kind of on my agenda. And that's because I think it's very important to make the past talk to the present and to the future. So, you know, I take the fact that archaeology is political very seriously, but I also think that, you know, the past is something we create through our work. And the past is something in its kind of vast complexity and weirdness and alienness to the present that can give us tools or inspiration or alternatives to look at our contemporary world and the paths that we're on and try and find other paths, try and find directions into places that are more equal, that are less fragmented, that are more socially cohesive, that are less violent. And so I like to think that what I'm doing when I do my work is building increasingly complex pasts so that we have more inspiration or alternatives or possibilities for the futures we want to live. We can kind of break free of the structure, the sense that, well, it's always been this way and we have no choices. And this is just, you know, the path dependency of it all. There are alternatives. People lived in a million different ways and they built their societies in a million different ways and they made their gender systems look totally differently and they understood their relationships with the natural world in a million different ways. There's no kind of one way of doing anything in human history or human kind of deep history. And I think that sense of diversity of possibility has been lost a little bit in the last, certainly in the last few decades, definitely in the last couple of centuries. And it would be nice to bring that myriad possibility back into dialogue with the present and into thinking about where we're going in the future. How that actually works, you know, we'll see. And in terms of what the next kind of actual project is, you know, we'll see. I'm a big believer in the projects find you, you don't find them. I never expected to be working alongside geneticists or talking about genetic data. I started out as a stone tool specialist, but it came and found me, and I was the right person in the right time to have certain conversations, and people wanted to have those conversations with me, so I've kept doing it. And that's kind of how I've done my research career. Very little planning, quite a lot of yapping.
No, that's wonderful. So I think this is thank you so much for sharing that and you know, giving us such a complete perspective on your research, but also its implications to help us think about the importance of interdisciplinary research, you know, in the reconstruction of the human past, which is a reconstruction, the limitations to that, and you know, for being so you know, eloquently thinking about the political implications of this all as well. And so we once again thank you. It was a pleasure to have you on our podcast, Kate.
My pleasure, João, always.
Thank you.